the Medici.
Chapter 15. Giulio, Clement VII.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
Giulio, Clement VII. Born 1478. Pope 1523 to 1534. Died 1534. 1. The first 4 years of his pontificate. Clement VII has generally been looked upon as a more or less feeble intriguer, humbly carrying out, during the pontificate of his cousin Leo X, plans originated by the latter, and involved in disasters in his own pontificate owing to want of ability. How far from the truth is the first portion of this view of him has already been shown, while as regards the second portion it will be seen in the sequel that the disasters in question, far from being due to any want of ability, were deliberately incurred for the sake of a single definite object which governed all his actions. Giulio de Medici, son of the Giuliano killed in the Pazzi conspiracy, was tall and good looking, spare in figure, of agreeable manners, and, except his uncle Lorenzo the Magnificent, was the cleverest of all this able family. Ranke, speaking of him after he became Pope, says: "He spoke with equal knowledge of his subject, whether that were philosophy and theology, or mechanics and hydraulic architecture. In all affairs he displayed an extraordinary acuteness. The most perplexing questions were unravelled, the most difficult circumstances penetrated to the very bottom, by his extreme sagacity. No man could debate a point with more address, and he manifested a circumspect ability in practice which none could surpass. At the same time he was, as we have seen, of a cold-hearted and crafty disposition, and absolutely unscrupulous, with none of those qualities of kind-heartedness, magnanimity, and cheerful bonhomie which in the case of his cousin, Leo X, helped to balance great faults. In this member of the family we see the Medici reaching their highest importance in the politics of Europe, and their history becoming, for a time, to the large extent that of Europe. But more than this, we see in him one who turned this family from those aims which his ancestors had followed, who set it upon a path where even success could confer no glory, and who, leading it to strive after an ignoble aim, brought upon the name of Medici obloquy and condemnation, where before it had won honour and esteem. This course of action, already steadily pursued by Giulio ever since the family were reinstated in Florence, was now to have a greater development. Upon the death of Adrian VI, the same disgraceful scenes which had characterized the previous conclave were repeated, and this time they lasted much longer. For 7 weeks the bribing and intriguing continued, Giulio's 2 chief antagonists being Wolsey and Alessandro Farnese. At length, on the 19th November, Giulio triumphed, and was elected Pope, assuming the name of Clement VII. He was then 45 years old. On becoming Pope, the first point which Giulio, now Clement VII, had to settle was how to retain the rule of Florence in the elder branch of the family, seeing that he himself could no longer reside there, that Lorenzo's only child was a girl of 4 years old, and that Giuliano's son, Ippolito, was too young at present to be entrusted with authority. Under these circumstances, Clement decided for the present to delegate the control of Florentine affairs to Cardinal Passerini as his representative. Accordingly, Passerini was in May 1524 sent to Florence, and for the next 3 years Florentine affairs were administered by him under orders from Rome, though the Signoria continued to be ostensibly the ruling body. With Cardinal Passerini, Clement also sent Giuliano's son Ippolito, now a handsome, intelligent, and attractive youth of 15, who was looked upon by all as destined to succeed to the authority exercised by his father 12 years before with such satisfaction to the Florentines. He took up his abode with Cardinal Passerini at the Medici Palace, assumed the title of Il Magnifico, and was elected a member of the government. A few months later there was also sent to Passerini's charge, from Naples, where he had been brought up, another boy, Alessandro, then about 13, who now for the first time appears in connection with Florence, and whose woolly hair and negro-like appearance had already caused him to be called the Moor. This boy's origin was a secret. Born during the time that the family were in exile, he was in reality the son of Clement himself, but the latter had hidden the fact, and kept the boy out of sight as long as he could. Subsequently, after Giuliano, Lorenzo, and Leo X were all dead, Clement brought this boy forward as an illegitimate son of Lorenzo. The fact that Clement had not yet begun to make this claim, and to pass Alessandro off as Lorenzo's heir, at the time when he first became Pope, is corroborated by what took place on that occasion. For when Clement, on becoming Pope, consulted the envoys of Florence as to what he should do with regard to that state, 3 of them advised him to give the supreme power to a gonfaloniere, appointed from year to year, until Ippolito was old enough to rule. It is significant that it was Ippolito who was mentioned, and not Alessandro, as must have been the case had the latter been declared at this time to be the heir of Lorenzo. It was not until 3 or 4 years later that Clement devised the scheme of passing over Ippolito in favor of Alessandro, giving as a reason that he was Lorenzo's son. The 11 years' pontificate of Clement VII, 1523 to 1534, was a troubled time in Europe. The triangular duel which Charles V, Francis I, and Henry VIII carried on lasted for 26 years, never ceasing until Francis and Henry both died in the same year, 1547, and during the first half of this long struggle it was Clement VII who kept this contest alive. The latter, during the whole of his reign as Pope, was employed in prosecuting vast schemes of diplomacy, all with the object of playing off Francis against Charles, to prevent their combining against himself, and of effecting his own designs while pretending to favour each of theirs in turn. Thus, whereas Adrian VI had striven to create peace between them, Clement's whole aim was to inflame their animosities to the utmost. In this he succeeded only too well, and by their unceasing wars large portions of Europe were laid waste, ravaged by ruthless and undisciplined armies, whose track was like that of a pestilence. It is curious to note the sanguine expectations which were formed when Clement VII succeeded to the papal throne, and how strangely they were falsified. It was anticipated that his pontificate would show all that had been best in that of Leo X, while avoiding its defects. Belonging to a family so renowned for their patronage of literary and artistic culture, and being himself fond of art, culture, music, and the conversation of learned men, it was confidently asserted that there would be a restoration of that culture which had been put to flight by his predecessor, while from his sober temperament it was presumable that there would be none of that extravagance and luxury which had marked the reign of Leo X. Lastly, of his great administrative ability there was no doubt. He had ruled Rome well in Leo's day, while at Florence he had on 2 separate occasions put an end to dissensions, reorganized the finances, and given general satisfaction in the midst of discordant elements. There appeared, therefore, every ground for the confident expectation entertained that his pontificate would be an unusually satisfactory one. Yet the result was extraordinarily the reverse. The difficulties surrounding him on becoming Pope, and the qualities he possessed for meeting them, are thus described by Trollope. The time was a difficult one for any Pope. But a straight course along an open road would have been less congenial to the talents and temperament of Giulio de Medici than one where intrigue, craft, and wily policy were necessary, and the situation was one exactly suited to his talents and disposition. Calm, moderate, unimpassioned, active, vigilant, astute, with nothing genial, large, or noble about him, but decorous, correct, and eminently respectable, while at bottom thoroughly unscrupulous, it might have been thought that Clement was just the man for the occasion, and that he, if any man, was bound to rise a winner from the slippery game of the politics of the time. Yet the result was such that his pontificate has been called the most disastrous of any pontiff who ever sat on the papal throne. Clement was not long in showing what would be the general character of his policy. Soon after he became pope, the emperor, anxious to bring about that reform of the Church which Adrian VI had not been given time to effect, began to suggest the assembly of a general council. Clement professed entire agreement, but by plausible stipulations contrived to create difficulty after difficulty in the emperor's path, hoping meanwhile that the pressure of war would soon give the latter other matters to attend to. This result soon followed, and during the next 4 years Clement's endeavors to keep the two great rivals at feud were so successful that widespread war swept backwards and forwards in turn over Burgundy, northern France, southern France, Savoy, northern Italy, and southern Italy. Clement at first took the side against Francis, who was beset with difficulties. 3 armies had entered France, a Spanish force advancing into Languedoc, a German one entering France on the northeast, and an English one occupying Picardy. On the other hand, a large French army under Bonnivet had, as already noted, invaded Lombardy. Charles's armies in northern and southern France were repulsed by the French, but in Lombardy, where the imperial army was commanded by Lannoy, Viceroy of Naples, with whom were Pescara and Bourbon, the French suffered serious reverses. All through these wars the Spanish generals were superior to the French. Francis had no good general, and suffered perpetually from the irretrievable loss he had caused himself by having driven from his service Charles, Duke of Bourbon. In 1524 the French army in Lombardy was at length forced by Lannoy to commence a disastrous retreat toward France, and in this retreat was severely defeated at the passage of Sesia, where the Chevalier Bayard, the knight sans peur et sans reproche, who commanded the rear guard of Bonnivet's army, was mortally wounded and died on the field. The imperial army, driving the French before it, advanced into southern France, and laid siege to Marseilles. Francis, as though the ordinary miseries of war were not enough, met this invasion by laying waste the whole of Provence, the garden of southern France, in order that the invading army might be unable to subsist. The entire population of the district was made to move elsewhere, villages were razed to the ground, cattle driven off, crops destroyed, and the sufferings of the people were almost as great as though they had been the captives of a hostile force. By this measure the imperial army, after heavy losses from disease and starvation, was forced to quit France and retired again into Italy. Clement, who hitherto had encouraged Charles, now began to intrigue with Francis, and in December 1524 concluded a secret treaty with him. Meanwhile Francis, elated by his success in Provence, prepared, against the advice of his ministers and generals, and even of his mother, Louise of Savoy, to invade Lombardy, with a large army under his own command. All the flower of the French nobility flocked to join this expedition. Francis appointed his mother regent of France in his absence, and marched for Italy with the most powerful army which had till then been seen in war. At first Francis was successful. He took Milan, and then proceeded to attack Pavia, defended by the experienced Spanish general Antonio de Leyva. During 3 months Pavia sustained a most rigorous siege, everything known to the engineers of that age being employed to reduce it. Francis added strong reinforcements to his army, bringing up a large body of Swiss troops, and also receiving troops sent to join him by Clement, commanded by Giovanni della Bandinere, now the foremost commander of his time among the Italians. Meanwhile, Lannoy, Pescara, and Bourbon were collecting troops sufficient to oppose the powerful army of Francis, and at length advanced to the relief of Pavia. A great battle was fought outside the walls on the 24th February, 1525, in which the French sustained the most fatal defeat known in those times. The Battle of Pavia is the greatest military event of the 16th century. Francis I, who very nearly lost his life owing to his refusal to surrender to the Duke of Bourbon, was taken prisoner. Nearly the whole of the French nobility were either killed or captured. 10,000 men of the French army were killed and the rest surrendered, and in a fortnight after the battle not a Frenchman remained in Italy except those who were prisoners in Lannoy's hands. It was a crushing defeat for France, whose whole military strength had been collected in this army commanded in person by the king. Lannoy at once sent news of his victory to Charles V, who was in Spain, and shortly afterwards escorted Francis I thither as a prisoner. Clement VII, aghast at the mistake he had made, deserted Francis, and hastened to make a treaty with the Emperor. But it was a hollow affair, and Clement's punishment was only postponed until the Emperor had leisure for it. For one of Clement's pieces of deception at this time, Florence has reason to be glad. After the Battle of Pavia, Clement, in his terror, was anxious to propitiate Federigo Gonzaga, Marquis of Mantua, one of the Emperor's chief adherents in Italy. Gonzaga expressed a desire to possess the portrait of Leo X, painted by Raphael, which was in the Medici Palace at Florence. Clement promised he should have it, and wrote from Rome, ordering that the picture should be sent to the Marquis of Mantua as soon as a copy of it, which he at the same time directed to be made by Andrea del Sarto, was completed. Andrea del Sarto made so good a copy that no one could tell the difference, and this copy was sent to Mantua, purporting to be the original. Even Giulio Romano, Raphael's own pupil, did not detect the deception until it was pointed out to him, years afterwards, by Vasari. It is impossible to believe that this fraud was carried out without the secret orders of Clement VII. The result, however, is that the original remained in the possession of the Medici, and hangs with that portion of their pictures which now forms the Pitti Gallery in Florence. In 1526, Francis I, after 13 months' captivity in Spain, obtained his liberty, on condition that he would restore Burgundy, would agree not to attack Milan again, and would reinstate Charles, Duke of Bourbon, in the estates of which the latter had been robbed by Louise of Savoy. Some writers have maintained that the terms were too severe, but, on the contrary, in view of the crushing victory which Charles had won at Pavia, they must be held to be exceedingly moderate. No indemnity was extorted, nor any attempt made to cripple the power of France for the future. Francis I gave his 2 sons, Francis and Henry, then respectively 10 and 9 years old, as hostages for this agreement. But as soon as he reached France, he repudiated the whole of it, and was absolved therefrom by Clement, who had resolved again to change sides, since Charles was becoming too strong. Clement now formed an alliance, which he called the Holy League, consisting of France, England, and the Pope, with Venice and Florence, to oppose Charles, to relieve Francesco Sforza, besieged in Milan by the imperial army, and to set Francis's sons at liberty. Clement expected that Francis would be the life and soul of this league. But Francis, owing to his defeat and imprisonment, had gone through such a time of distress that his spirit was for a time cowed. He desired tranquillity, and for the first time failed to be roused by the Pope's incitements. He delayed doing anything except to allow certain troops to be engaged for him by Clement in Italy, among them the corps commanded by the latter's relative, Giovanni del Bandanere, for whom Clement was, as usual, anxious to find some fighting to do. The forces assembled by Venice and the Pope were placed under command of the Duke of Urbino, and advanced against the imperial army in Lombardy. But the Duke of Urbino, no great friend of Clement, by losing several opportunities, gave Bourbon time to bring up reinforcements to the imperial army. Bourbon immediately took command of the latter, and very soon captured Milan, and drove the allied forces to retire on Lodi. It was in these operations that Giovanni della Bandanere was killed near Mantua. While these events were taking place in France and Italy, Germany was in a state of turmoil through the conflict on the subject of religion, which had now developed into actual war. To allay these conditions, which weakened Germany at a time when it was especially necessary that she should be strong, Charles assembled the Diet of the Empire at Spire to consider the religious differences, and this meeting of the Diet granted great toleration to Luther's opinions, so much so that the resolutions passed on this occasion came to form a sort of Magna Carta to the Protestant cause. They had a political object. The Turks were now pouring into Hungary, and the Emperor was urgent to oppose them, but could not do so as long as half his territories were torn by these dissensions. He hoped by the settlement at Spire to get the Protestant princes of Germany to march with him against the Turks. It was, however, already too late, and in August the Turks gained a great victory over Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs, in which Louis II, King of Hungary, was killed. Though not evident at the time, we can see now that Clement VII, by his course of action, became himself the chief assistant to the cause of Protestantism. Every time he induced Francis to attack Charles, he made it more difficult for the latter to deal with the rising tide of revolt against the Church taking place in Germany, which needed all Charles's attention, and which he probably would have assuaged, or at all events greatly mitigated, had he not been forced to devote most of his attention to the defence of those parts of the empire attacked by Francis, attacks in most cases instigated or encouraged by Clement. Meanwhile, retribution was being prepared for the latter. The Emperor thought it time to give him a lesson, and punish him for his various tortuous dealings. In September 1526, therefore, the Emperor drew up a manifesto, systematically setting forth the treacherous manner in which the Pope had acted throughout the previous 3 years. He then instructed his agent, Moncada, to stir up the powerful family of the Colonna, who attacked and plundered the Vatican, drove Clement to take refuge in the castle of St. Angelo, and there made him, as a condition of his release, agree to renounce the Holy League, to withdraw his troops from Lombardy, and to give hostages for his good faith. But Clement was not to be held firm, even by the giving of hostages. As soon as he was again free, he repudiated his engagements, collected a force, attacked the territory of the Colonna, razed to the ground 14 of their castles and villages, and executed a general massacre of men, women, and children belonging to them, thus filling up the cup of his misdeeds. Then the Emperor, always deliberate, and never relinquishing any purpose which he had once formed, prepared a terrible vengeance. He sent, during November and December, additional troops from Spain to Lannoy, his commander in southern Italy, and from Germany to Bourbon, his commander in northern Italy, Pescara having just died, and ordered Bourbon on their arrival to march upon the Papal States. The imperial army in Italy was composed of all the greatest ruffians from every race in Europe, Spanish and Germans predominating. They had been, for some time, deliberately kept by Charles V without pay, and the state of want to which they were reduced made these troops almost unmanageable except by Bourbon, who, from his many qualities as a general, had a wonderful power over them. Nevertheless, his position was rendered most difficult. Northern Italy, ravaged by these incessant wars, was almost a desert, and could no longer support his troops. To increase his difficulties, there now came to join his army, already in arrears of pay, this addition of 16,000 Lutheran troops from Germany, who had not only been promised their pay on reaching Lombardy, and were bent upon plunder, but also came with a fixed determination to execute vengeance upon the Pope, to whose faithlessness they attributed all the woes of Christendom. To his charge were laid the long continuance of war throughout Europe, the defeats sustained from the Turks, even their own present state of privation, and they openly announced their intention of marching to Rome and hanging the Pope. Their commander, Frundsberg, ostentatiously carried with him a silken rope for this especial purpose. In January 1527, Bourbon made over the government of Milan to Antonio de Leyva, and set his army in motion southwards. On reaching Bologna, where he halted for a short time during February, a mutiny of his troops, who were now in the greatest destitution, was only pacified by his promising to march upon Rome. Clement, threatened by Bourbon from the north and Lannoy from the south, and terrified to find the same storm coming upon himself which he had brought upon so many others, sent urgent appeals to Francis to deliver him. But Francis had not yet recovered from the blow to his spirit caused by his own defeat and captivity, while he himself had certain scores to pay off upon Clement, and he made no effort to prevent matters from taking their course. Bourbon's unruly horde continued, therefore, to move slowly forwards, while Clement clamored for aid in every direction, and even offered 100,000 ducats if this would appease the Lutheran troops. But the latter were obdurate. Clement made overtures to Lannoy, who came, bringing the above sum of money to Bourbon, but more than twice that amount was due for the arrears of pay alone, and Lannoy dared not approach the camp, as the Lutheran troops, bent upon personal vengeance on the Pope, would not hear of any truce, and threatened to kill even Lannoy himself if he interfered with them, while Frundsberg, their own immediate commander, was just at this time struck down by apoplexy. They were determined to hang the Pope and sack Rome, would obey no other general than Bourbon, and would not obey even him unless he led them towards Rome. So while Clement, now in the greatest terror, offered every possible and impossible concession to any who would come to his assistance, the resistless torrent rolled steadily on through the valleys of Romagna and Umbria, Bourbon subsisting his hungry and ferocious troops on the country passed through, whose inhabitants had sore reason to curse Clement for bringing this terrible visitation upon them. On the evening of the 5th May, the army encamped outside Rome, and the troops at last feasted their eyes on its palaces, and promised themselves, as the reward of all their hardships, the plunder of the Papal city. Next morning Bourbon, the ferocious Bourbon, as his enemies called him, fastening upon himself the chief characteristic of the miserable material given him to command, whom his many misfortunes had made tired of life, drew up his army for the attack. He led the assault himself, ascended the first ladder placed against the walls, and fell, mortally wounded, as his victorious troops gained the city, his last act being to have himself covered with a cloak, that his soldiers might not be discouraged by seeing his condition. 6th May, 1527. Then followed the terrible sack of Rome. As the imperial army burst into the city, Clement took refuge in the castle of St. Angelo, while his troops were being pursued by enemies who gave no quarter, and who were doubly enraged by the death of their adored commander. And Clement was now able to see some of the results of his crafty policy and double dealing. The pandemonium which followed is indescribable. The Lutheran troops took pleasure in destroying and defiling all that the Catholic world had revered. Robertson says: "It is impossible to describe or even imagine the misery and horror of the scene that followed. Whatever a city taken by storm can dread from military rage unrestrained by discipline, whatever excesses the ferocity of the Germans, the avarice of the Flemings, or the licentiousness of the Spaniards could commit, these wretched inhabitants of Rome were obliged to suffer. Churches, palaces, and houses were plundered without distinction. No age or character was exempt from injury. Cardinals, nobles, priests, matrons, virgins, were all the prey of the soldiers, and at the mercy of men deaf to the voice of humanity. Nor did these outrages cease, as is usual in towns carried by assault, when the first fury of the storm was over. The imperial army, unable to be controlled by any general now Bourbon was dead, kept possession of the city for many months, and during all that time the brutality of the soldiers continued. Their booty in ready money alone amounted to 1,000,000 ducats. What they raised by ransoms and exactions far exceeded that sum. Rome, though taken various times by the northern nations in the 5th and 6th centuries, was never treated with so much cruelty by the barbarous and heathen Huns, Vandals, or Goths as now by this terrible foe. While these scenes were being enacted, Clement, the author of all this, was a close prisoner in the castle of Sant'Angelo, besieged by those troops who, as he well knew, had often sworn to hang him, and were now uncontrolled by the only general who had any power over them. On Bourbon's death, the command devolved upon Philibert, Prince of Orange, but the troops made no pretence of obeying him, and it was with difficulty that he could even persuade some of them to desist from plunder and invest the castle of Sant'Angelo. The Duke of Urbino advanced with an army consisting of Venetians, Florentines, and Swiss, in the pay of Francis I, strong enough to have overpowered the army of the Prince of Orange. But the Duke of Urbino had an old score to pay off against Clement, since the time when the latter had helped to rob him of his duchy. So to tantalize him by raising false hopes in his mind, he merely brought his army near enough for Clement to see it, and then marched away, leaving him surrounded by the furious enemies who thirsted for his blood. The Emperor courteously expressed sorrow at the Pope's misfortune, but the imperial army remained where it was. Nor, in fact, could any power have removed it, for the troops found Rome exceedingly pleasant quarters, and had not the slightest intention of obeying any order to quit the city, so long as anything remained to eat or to plunder. Clement continued besieged by them in the castle of Sant'Angelo for 7 months, and his action when, reduced to great straits, he bade Cellini, who was with him there, to melt down his tiara, was symbolical of the position to which he had brought himself. At length he contrived to escape, disguised as a pedlar, and fled in miserable plight, and with only one attendant, to Orvieto, where he arrived in a most forlorn state, destitute of everything. A disastrous conclusion to 4 years of tortuous scheming. 8th December, 1527. The imperial army remained firmly planted in Rome, and seemed likely to take root there for good. Lannoy succeeded the Prince of Orange in command, but died of the plague. All the splendor of the Rome of Leo X was destroyed, and when, after 9 months' occupation, the army, utterly demoralized by its long debauch, was driven out of the city by the plague, they left it a ruined and desolate waste. Meanwhile, as soon as the news arrived of Pope Clement's disaster, and of his being besieged in the castle of Sant'Angelo, Florence, seeing now an opportunity of throwing off the yoke which he had long been craftily but steadily tightening upon her, revolted from his authority, and for the 3rd time banished the Medici family. 19th May, 1527. At the same time, Venice, taking advantage of the opportunity, seized Ravenna and other places in the States of the Church, and the Dukes of Ferrara and Urbino resumed possession of those territories of which the papacy had deprived them. At this juncture also, Henry VIII of England began to press Clement to grant him a divorce from his queen, Catherine of Aragon, the aunt of Charles V. But Clement was truly not just then in a position to offend Charles further, or to give attention to such matters. Born 1478, Pope 1523 to 1534, died 1534. 2. The last 7 years of his pontificate. That Florence should revolt from him, and for a 3rd time banish his family, is said to have been more intolerable to Clement VII than even the sack of Rome and all his other misfortunes. It was a severe blow to his long cherished scheme. To his former plans there was now added the desire for vengeance. Meanwhile Florence was jubilant. She had reasserted her independence, and had good grounds for hoping to maintain it. Stronger as a state than Rome, the only thing she had to fear was the Pope's gaining allies, and in the condition to which Clement had brought his affairs, this seemed highly improbable. The Emperor's animosity had been thoroughly roused, and he and the Pope seemed now too hopelessly estranged to be ever likely to reunite. Francis I was Florence's ally, and besides this had, in his contest with Charles, other work for his troops than to employ them on Clement's behalf in the latter's private quarrel with Florence. Henry VIII was also Florence's ally, and incensed against Clement for his evasive replies in the matter of his divorce. Genoa, Venice, and Ferrara were all allied with Florence, while the smaller states were nearly all at enmity with Clement for one cause or another. Lastly, he himself was a fugitive, plundered of everything, and in a destitute condition. But the Florentines, notwithstanding their long knowledge of him who has been called the master of craft, had not fathomed the capabilities of that fertile brain for finding a way even through such a tangled web as this. Clement's main difficulty was that, while he could not hope to regain power over Florence without the hope of one or other of the two great antagonists, if he obtained the assistance of one, the other would at once take the opposite side, and so neutralize matters. How to avoid this, therefore, became a problem to the solution of which he turned all his mental powers. First, however, he had to make his peace with Charles, and get the Emperor's Spanish, Flemish, and German bulldogs, which had been so ruthlessly let loose upon him, made to let go from his throat. As the price of this release, Charles imposed upon him the most humiliating terms, including the surrender of a large part of the papal territories and the payment of a heavy fine, to all of which Clement had to submit. In February 1527, soon after Clement reached Orvieto, Francis again declared war against Charles. Henry sided with Francis, hoping thereby to secure the latter's influence with the Pope in the matter of his divorce. For Clement, now completely in the power of Charles, was secretly intriguing with Francis, and urging on this war, in the hope that it would liberate him from this state of bondage. With France and England, the other allies against Charles were Venice, Genoa, Florence, and Ferrara. Florence made a fatal mistake in the side she took in this war. Before it began, the Emperor offered, if she would side with him against Francis, to secure her against the Pope; and Niccolo Capponi, who was Gonfaloniere, exerted all his influence to induce his countrymen to accept this offer, foreseeing that the Pope would eventually contrive to patch up matters with the Emperor, and that whenever this occurred, Francis would prove a broken reed. But the Florentines insisted on clinging to the French alliance, and 3 years later had bitter reason to repent their mistake. As before, Italy was the principal battlefield. A French army under de Lautrec advanced against Charles's dominions in northern Italy. A second army, assisted by the Genoese fleet, attacked his kingdom of Naples, and for the next year and a half war raged throughout Italy. In October 1528, Clement, who had moved in June from Orvieto to Viterbo, was at last able to return to Rome. He was horror-stricken on seeing its condition, finding it ruined, half burnt, and the population diminished by one half. Meanwhile matters were going against the French. They lost the valuable alliance of Genoa. A few months afterwards, the whole French army in southern Italy had to capitulate. And lastly, their army in northern Italy suffered a severe defeat from Antonio de Leyva. Exhausted by so many reverses, Francis was inclined to make peace, and to this end discussions regarding a treaty between the two antagonists went on for months at Cambrai, between Louise of Savoy on the part of Francis and Margaret of Austria on the part of Charles. The above position of affairs caused Clement to consider that the time was ripe for carrying out a great scheme, the details of which he had been elaborating for many months. Seldom, surely, has such vast machinery been set in motion to attain such a petty object. Europe was now to see the politics of France, England, Spain, Germany, and Italy all manipulated, in order that Clement might compass his aim of regaining power over Florence and exalting a scion of his family to be despot over it. Accordingly, in June 1529, while the endless discussions between Louise and Margaret were still continuing at Cambrai, Clement proceeded to Spain, where Charles then was, and laid before him certain proposals for their combined action. The result of this was a secret compact concluded between Charles and himself at Barcelona towards the end of June, which soon had important results to all the countries then at war, though the arrangements made between Charles and Clement in this dubious plot were not allowed to transpire for some little time, but became apparent by degrees in the terms of the Treaty of Cambrai, and in Charles's proceedings in Italy a few months later. This compact was followed in August 1529 by the conclusion of the Treaty of Cambrai between Francis and Charles, in which Francis agreed to abandon his allies, England, Venice, Ferrara, and Florence, to pay a ransom for his sons, to withdraw his troops from all Charles's territories, and to renounce all interference in the future with affairs in Italy. The last item was the principal one, and was that which Clement had employed all his art to secure. Simultaneously with this treaty between Francis and Charles, Clement gave Henry some encouragement in the matter of his divorce, and the latter, anxious to obtain this, offered no remonstrance against the abandonment of the other allies by Francis, and himself followed the same course. This left of the original allies against Charles only Venice, Ferrara, and Florence, deserted by the rest. The above treaty, combined with the thraldom in which he held the Pope, made Charles complete master of Italy. He now proceeded for the first time to that country, where his armies had been fighting for nearly 8 years, almost uninterruptedly, to settle its affairs and to carry out the remaining provisions of the secret compact which had been made between himself and Clement. Reaching Genoa at the end of August, he proceeded to Milan, where he reinstated Francesco Sforza as Duke and dictated terms of peace to Venice and Ferrara. In accordance with the secret compact at Barcelona, Charles treated Venice and Ferrara leniently, and only required from them the restitution to the Pope of the territories they had seized from him in 1527. This left Florence alone, bereft of all her allies. Genoa, France, England, Venice, and Ferrara had one by one been separated from her. Nor was Florence given any opportunity of making her peace with the Emperor in the same way as Venice and Ferrara had done, for this would have prevented that destruction of her republic which was the object of all these manoeuvres on Clement's part. Moreover, another item in the Barcelona compact now transpired, for, as the price of his submission on all other points, Clement had stipulated that the imperial army should be lent to him to enable him to crush Florence, to which Charles had agreed, on Clement's pointing out that the eventual result would be to the Emperor's own advantage, since instead of a turbulent republic there would be substituted a ruler who would be a vassal of the Emperor. Thus had Clement, in a course of 2 years' intricate diplomacy, gradually got the bundle of sticks separated, and also obtained the assistance against Florence of Charles's army, for which Clement agreed to pay, while Francis, under the terms of the Treaty of Cambrai, was debarred from interfering. The sum total was a triumph of that kind of diplomacy in which Clement delighted, and in which he excelled. Accordingly, in the end of September 1529, the imperial army was ordered to march upon Florence, and in December, while the siege of Florence was proceeding, Clement and Charles met again, this time at Bologna, to perfect these arrangements, to add certain other clauses to the contract between them, and for Charles to be crowned by Clement with the imperial crown. This coronation took place on the 24th February 1530, and in April Clement returned to Rome, having, in the further clauses to their compact added at Bologna, set on foot arrangements concerning a private and domestic scheme which he was elaborating as regards his own family. He had by this time determined to supplant Ippolito by Alessandro, and to give the rule of Florence, whenever that state should be subdued, to the latter. But he kept this carefully concealed from all except the Emperor until the time should come, and until he should find means to dispose of Ippolito in some manner which should prevent him from interfering with this plan. The terms of the secret compact to which Clement had induced Charles to agree at Barcelona, and which was thus finally completed between them at Bologna, were such as fully showed Clement's unscrupulous character, while in them we see that scheme at last taking shape upon which he had been for so many years bent as regards Florence, and which 2 years before had seemed as though it would have to be abandoned. The principal terms were: 1. That on Florence, being isolated from her allies by the arrangements settled upon as regarded France, England, Venice, and Ferrara, the imperial army should be lent to Clement, with which to attack and subdue her. 2. That the independence of Florence should be abolished. 3. That Alessandro, called by Clement the son of Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, should be invested by the Emperor with the rule of Florence, holding that state as the Emperor's vassal. And 4. That Margaret, a daughter of the Emperor, then 9 years old, should be married to Alessandro as soon as she should be old enough. But the third and fourth articles were not allowed to transpire until more than a year later, Clement having private reasons for keeping them secret for the present. It may be imagined with what indignation the Florentines heard of this resolution to extinguish their beloved republic, and with what determination they prepared to fight to the death against it. Regarding this whole matter, Renca's comment is as follows: With astonishment did men behold him, Clement, after so many indignities, again connect himself with the Emperor. He so completely changed his policy that the very army by which the horrors of the sack of Rome had been perpetrated before his eyes, and himself held so long a captive, he now called to his assistance, and launched upon his native city. Nevertheless, Florence did not lose heart, though opposed to the united power of the Pope and Emperor. Her field army was placed under Francesco Ferrucci, other troops being enrolled to form the garrison of the city. All round the walls of the city a space 1 mile wide was ruthlessly cleared, so as to afford no cover to the enemy, every tree, including those of vineyards and fruit gardens, being cut down, and every building, including even churches, being demolished, and notwithstanding the fact that some of these suburbs were almost like towns. The Venetian ambassador, Carlo Capello, writing to his government, comments on the widespread ruin thus caused, the many beautiful villas that had been burnt by their owners, and the greatness of mind displayed by the general willingness to suffer all these losses for the sake of liberty. One exception only was made, viz. The monastery of San Salvi, on account of Andrea del Sarto's fresco of the Last Supper, which art-loving Florence had not the heart to destroy. On the 14th October 1529, the imperial army, commanded by the Prince of Orange, appeared before Florence and occupied all the high ground on the southern side, at a distance of about a mile from the walls, from near Rusciano on the east, round to Monte Oliveto on the west, while another equally large force occupied the country on the northern side of the city. Before the investment was complete, Florence sent an embassy to Clement, in Rome, to appeal to his mercy, but they met only with a cold refusal. Yet the troops whom he had gathered round Florence were the ferocious ruffians of many nationalities whom Bourbon had commanded, and Clement had hired them with 80,000 florins and the promise of the plunder of Florence, while we are told that even before this army left Lombardy the soldiers' usual oath had become, "by the glorious sack of Florence." There was therefore no doubt as to what was the fate in store for Florence if this enemy got within her walls. Florence's struggle in defence of her independence was worthy of her former history. She defended herself for 10 months against all that the imperial army could do, and at one time it looked as though she would win. Michelangelo laid aside his chisel and became his country's principal engineer, in particular designing all the defences around San Miniato, the principal point of attack. Francesco Carducci was the gonfaloniere, and although he had not the ability of his predecessor, Niccolò Capponi, he was a worthy and patriotic head of the government. But the chief hero of the defence is Florence's noble general, Francesco Ferrucci, who well deserved the niche in Florence's temple of fame which he has gained. Keeping the field, and holding the neighbouring town of Empoli, he managed steadily to pour in thence supplies into Florence, again and again defeating the imperial detachments with his numerically inferior forces, and hampering the Prince of Orange by the knowledge that there was an army in the field on his flank. And so well did he maintain his country's cause that it became at length evident that the imperial army would never take Florence so long as Ferrucci remained unconquered. It would have been well for Florence if her forces within the city had been commanded by a man of like character. But here she had made the fatal mistake of employing a foreigner, Malatesta Baglioni, one of that blood-stained family who had previously ruled Perugia, and this caused her defeat. He was a traitor from the very first, and had sold the cause he was engaged to defend. Gino Capponi states that before the siege began Baglioni received from the Pope a written document promising him the lordship of Perugia, confirming any terms which he might make with the Prince of Orange, and conveying absolution for all crimes which he might commit during the siege of Florence. Nevertheless, though the garrison was so badly commanded, the imperial army failed to gain any success. In the sorties and skirmishes which took place almost daily, and were fought with great ferocity, the Florentines nearly always prevailed, and in December a well-arranged sortie of 3,000 men under Stefano Colonna was so successful that the besieging army would probably have been routed, had it not been for the treachery of Baglioni, who sounded the retreat when Colonna's force was carrying all before them. Month after month the struggle continued, and by degrees one after another of Florence's subject towns were captured: Volterra, Pistoia, Prato, Lastra, San Miniato al Tedesco, and others being successively taken by the imperial army. But these losses did not daunt Ferrucci, who harassed the enemy continually, and even recaptured Volterra and San Miniato al Tedesco. At length, in July 1530, the Prince of Orange, seeing that if he was ever to take Florence it was imperative first to defeat Ferrucci, desired to attack him with the greater part of his army, leaving only a weak force round the city. But he feared lest in his absence the garrison should sally out and defeat the force thus left behind. Baglioni, however, enabled him to effect his object, and to attack Ferrucci with an overwhelming force, by engaging not to make any such sortie during the Prince's absence. Thus assured, the latter marched away with a force more than double the strength of that commanded by Ferrucci, and attacked him. The battle between them decided the fate of Florence. It was fought at Gavinana, in the mountains above Pistoia, on the 3rd August 1530. After a severely contested battle, the imperial army won, chiefly because their brave opponents were nearly all destroyed. The two commanders, the Prince of Orange and Francesco Ferrucci, were both killed. Thereupon Florence surrendered, on condition, agreed to on Clement's part, that the ancient constitution should be preserved and the city ruled by the Signoria, but subject to the Emperor as the supreme power in Italy, Florence agreeing to pay an indemnity of 80,000 florins, while the Pope agreed to treat his countrymen with affection and clemency, as he had always done. Nevertheless, as soon as the city was in possession of the Pope, these terms were entirely ignored. Francesco Carducci, the brave head of the government during the siege, Niccolò de Lapi, Fra Benedetto da Foiano, a monk who during the siege had encouraged the citizens by his sermons, and many others, Iriart states to the number of 1,000, were put to death, while many of the leading citizens were imprisoned. The abolition of the Republic and the installation of Alessandro as Duke, Clement thought, even in the beaten condition of the Florentines, would be more safely carried out by successive steps. So for a time he caused the government to be carried on by his representative, Baccio Valori, the Signoria being allowed to continue, but all power being vested in Valori, who lived in the Palazzo della Signoria, surrounded by a strong body of the imperial troops. After this arrangement had lasted 10 months, Clement took the second step, by sending Alessandro from Rome to take Valori's place. He arrived on the 5th July 1531, and took up his abode in the Medici Palace. But before the final step of declaring the Republic abolished, and proclaiming Alessandro sole master of Florence, could be ventured upon, a fortress was necessary to contain the troops to support this despotism. Accordingly, for the present, Alessandro was only called head of the Republic, while arrangements were made for rapidly building a strong fortress, the present Fortezza da Basso, at the centre of the northern wall of the city. Clement VII's ancestors are often accused of despotism, but they had no need of a fortress. Now, however, that a despotism is in reality about to be set up, a fortress to support it is felt to be a sine qua non, so much so that the proclamation of that despotic rule is even delayed until the fortress is ready. As soon as the latter was sufficiently completed to be occupied by the troops lent by the Emperor to support Alessandro's authority, the third and final step was taken, and on the 1st May 1532, Alessandro summoned the members of the Signoria to the Medici Palace, and read out to them the Emperor's order that the Signoria was abolished, the Republic ended, and he himself to be sole ruler of Florence. At the same time, a similar proclamation was made from the Ringhiera, in front of the Palazzo della Signoria, the name of which was henceforth changed to Palazzo Vecchio. Alessandro also caused the great bell, La Vacca, which hung in the tower of the Palazzo Vecchio, and had summoned so many generations of Florentines to proclaim their will, to be thrown down and broken to pieces. The bell of the council, says Davanzati in his contemporary diary, was taken from us, in order that we should no more hear the sweet sound of liberty. Thus had Clement at last effected the completion of that project which he had assiduously pursued during 20 years. The further development of converting the ducal coronet into a crown was still unattained, but only one step more remained to reach it. The city, held in subjection by foreign troops, groaned in silence, but rage burnt under the surface at the manner in which its conquest had been effected, at the deliberate breach of the conditions under which it had surrendered, and at the odious tyranny to which it now found itself subjected. Michelangelo, when the city surrendered, fled for his life, and remained for some time in hiding. But his talents were too valuable to be lost, and Clement wanted him for the completion of the family monuments in the new sacristy, planned in the time of Leo X. So he was pardoned, and given orders to proceed with the work. It may be imagined with what feelings he returned to the execution of such a task in the midst of the daily humiliations of Alessandro's rule. What memories of a bygone, very different state of things in the happy days of his youth under Lorenzo the Magnificent, and what despair at the present degradation of Florence oppressed his soul as he laboured at these monuments, may be seen in his work. And there is no ground for the uncertainty which some have expressed as to what ideas Michelangelo meant to convey in these statues of day and night, evening and dawn, when they are studied in conjunction with the contemporary history and his own words. Footnote: Michelangelo, referring to the statue of Night, wrote, "Ah, glad I am to sleep in stone, while wrong and dire disgrace rage unreproved near. A happy chance to neither see nor hear. Oh, then wake me not. Hush, whisper low." End footnote. The great sculptor worked at the task given him full of the bitterest feelings at the ruin of his country, at the wrong which had been done to her, and at the dire disgrace of such a rule as that of Alessandro, and the statues refer to the day which once had been, and the dark night which had now settled down upon Florence, one regarding which he despaired of any dawn. Michelangelo left these monuments unfinished, not on account of any artistic reason, as some have fancied, but because on Clement's death in 1534, before they were completed, he precipitately fled from Florence, being in fear of the tyrant Alessandro's hate when once the Pope was dead. Germany. By the year 1530, Charles V had triumphed in every direction. Spain was reduced to subjection. On France had been inflicted the greatest defeat of the century. All temporal power had been taken from the Pope. Throughout Italy, Charles's supremacy was complete, while his brother Ferdinand had gained the crowns of both Hungary and Bohemia. But in Germany the contest about religion threatened to produce serious civil war. In 1530 Charles assembled the Diet of the Empire at Augsburg to endeavor to find means of healing the breach, and at this assembly Melanchthon put forward a creed which became a rallying point for the Lutheran party, now for the first time called Protestant. Every effort was made to find terms of agreement between the rival parties in this assembly, and at one time Charles hoped this had been effected. But the Protestants would yield nothing from their side, and after much discussion they were outvoted, and the Diet passed a decree severely condemning their opinions. As a consequence, the Protestant princes of Germany, secretly assisted by both Francis and Henry in order to embarrass the Emperor, formed for their mutual defence the League of Smalcalden. But the Turkish invasion of Hungary had now assumed formidable proportions, and to meet it Charles, after great efforts, managed at the Diet of Ratisbon in July 1532 to arrange a truce on the religious question, whereupon the Protestant princes agreed to march with him against the Turks. Accordingly, in August 1532, Charles led a large army against Suleiman, the Turkish Sultan, who, overawed by this great display of force, retreated precipitately without risking a battle, and evacuated Hungary and Croatia. Having thus rescued Hungary, the Emperor returned thence, and passed through Italy on his way to Spain. He had no intention of going to Rome, and ordered Clement to meet him at Bologna, regardless of the rough and difficult journey in which this would involve the Pope, who dared not go by the main road which passed through Florence. They met at Bologna in December 1532, when a second conference between them took place. At this meeting Clement was made to feel more than ever the galling yoke of his bondage to Charles. The latter knew that during his absence in Hungary Clement had been again making overtures to Francis, and intended to put a stop to all such procedure on his part. As a counterpoise, however, Clement had prepared a scheme for the Emperor's discomfiture. While the compact which he had secretly formed with Francis, and which included specific proposals for an attack on Milan, did not prevent Clement's forming, at this meeting, an agreement with Charles to oppose Francis, should the latter again endeavor to take Milan. England. For nearly 6 years, Clement had, by various artifices, been keeping Henry VIII at bay over the question of the divorce which he desired from his queen, Catherine of Aragon, the sister of Charles's mother, Joanna. Clement, in his position with regard to Charles, desired to retain the valuable aid of Henry as long as possible. At the same time, if forced to choose between the two, it was Charles whom he least dared to offend. And as the latter's power over him grew every year stronger, it became more and more certain that Clement would soon be forced to make that choice, and to break with Henry, however much he desired to avoid it. At last, in 1532, Henry would wait no longer. He first tried to force Clement to his will by making the English Parliament pass an act abolishing the payment of first fruits to the Pope, power being left in the king's hand to suspend the act until it should be seen whether the Pope should meet his wishes. As this failed to produce the desired effect, Henry then endeavored to force Clement to a decision between himself and Charles by forming an alliance with Francis against the Emperor. Charles's retort was the meeting to which he summoned Clement at Bologna in December 1532, at which he showed the Pope, with great plainness, that he must not dare to offend him, and must throw over Henry and refuse to agree to the divorce. But the more Charles made Clement feel his bondage to him, the more disinclined was the latter to lose any friendship which might sooner or later prove a help to him to get free from this yoke. Therefore, in secret, he still did not despair of contriving by some means to avoid an absolute rupture with Henry. On the 25th January, 1533, Henry was secretly married to Anne Boleyn. In February, Clement, ignorant of this marriage, granted at Henry's request a bull, making Thomas Cranmer Archbishop of Canterbury. In May, the question of whether or not Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon had been illegal was tried in the Archbishop's court. And on the 23rd May, both houses of convocation, several foreign universities, and many of the leading canonists of the day having given the opinion that that marriage was void from the first, the Archbishop, acting with other bishops, annulled it, and 3 days later confirmed that with Anne Boleyn. But even this did not cause Clement as yet to break with Henry. Francis was Henry's close ally, and Clement hoped to obtain Francis's influence with Henry to persuade him against a breach with the Pope. Therefore, though Clement expostulated and threatened, the final thunderbolt of an excommunication was held in abeyance for more than a year, Clement hoping by persuasion to induce Henry to take back his wife, when his fickle nature had had time to grow tired of Anne Boleyn. Although Clement had succeeded in his scheme as regards Florence, he did not find his own position improved. The Emperor still held him bound in fetters which were stronger than ever since Francis had been shut out from interfering in the affairs of Italy. And while thus cut off from gaining assistance from Francis, Clement felt that he was now being forced by Charles to break with Henry also, when he would become more than ever the Emperor's bondslave. Clement therefore now executed his great and final coup. During the latter end of 1532 he managed secretly to arrange a compact with Francis, which would bind the latter to him by an actual matrimonial alliance. This was nothing less than that the heiress of the Medici family, Catherine, now 14, should be married to Francis's second son, Henry, Duke of Orleans, now about 16. The bait by which Clement won over Francis to this proposal was not only the enormous dower which Catherine would bring with her, but also an agreement on Clement's part to assist the French king to retake Milan. Having secretly settled this with Francis, Clement proceeded in December 1532 to the meeting with Charles at Bologna, and there, in the course of their discussions, Clement mentioned to the Emperor the idea of such a marriage, pretending to ask his advice about it, and carefully concealing the fact that he had had any communications, on that or any other subject, with Francis. Charles, knowing that Francis was again planning to get hold of Milan, and being particularly anxious to prevent a friendship between him and Clement which might assist that endeavor, and never believing for a moment that Francis would agree to such a mésalliance, advised Clement to make the proposal, thinking that it would bring upon him a rebuff from Francis, which would produce ill feeling between them. Whereupon, to Charles' astonishment and disgust, the thing was promptly carried out. The Emperor having departed to Spain, Clement pushed on all the arrangements as fast as possible, and in October 1533 the marriage was performed by Clement himself, Francis also being present. As a part of the terms of this marriage, it was secretly agreed that on Francis gaining possession of Milan with the Pope's assistance, that duchy should be given to Henry, Catherine's husband, Clement hoping to gratify his ambition by seeing one of his family in power at Florence and the other at Milan. And Clement returned to Rome in December feeling much secret satisfaction, not only at having achieved so advantageous a marriage for his family, but also at having outwitted Charles, who had held him so long in chains, and who was left with no power of taking offence at this marriage, since he had been led by Clement into actually himself urging the latter to propose it. But Clement had not a long time in which to enjoy feelings of satisfaction. Before 5 months were over, there pressed upon him, from another direction, matters which made the last half year of his life more disastrous than all that had preceded. For the cloud in the west now grew to greater dimensions than those of a mere personal quarrel with the king, and in the last 6 months of Clement's life events supervened in England which, in their momentous importance to the papacy, threw all else into the background. For here was no case, as in Germany, of a certain number of individuals, however powerful, revolting from the Pope, but an entire national church was casting off his supremacy, and a whole nation, by its legislature, enacting laws prohibiting obedience to his authority, while a king, instead of restraining these actions, was instigating them. And this nation also was that which had hitherto furnished the largest supplies for the support of the papacy. If one or two more countries should act in the same manner, there would scarcely remain any papacy to fight for. In March 1534, both the Church and Parliament of England separately repudiated the supremacy of the Pope, the Convocation of the Church of England repudiating that supremacy as opposed to the principles of the Catholic Church, and an innovation which had not existed for the first 6 centuries of the Church's life, and declaring that the Pope hath no greater jurisdiction in this kingdom of England than any other foreign bishop, and the Parliament of England passing an act which made appeals to the Pope high treason. Thus the repudiation by the Church of England of the papal supremacy took place before the actual rupture between Henry and the Pope. This latter followed 4 months later, when in July 1534 the Pope pronounced a sentence of excommunication against Henry, unless he would take back Catherine of Aragon and put away Anne Boleyn, Clement thus still leaving a loophole, in the hope that a rupture between himself and Henry might even yet, at the 11th hour, be avoided. Henry, however, refused to do this, whereupon the breach became complete. Thus had Henry's personal quarrel with the Pope led to greater consequences than even a king's excommunication, and had enabled the Church of England to cast off that papal supremacy which had been wrongly imposed upon her for 5 centuries. The sentence of excommunication against Henry VIII was the last public act of Clement VII's life. He died less than 2 months afterwards, on the 25th September 1534, at the age of 56. His life ended in the midst of the gloom caused by the darkest of all the storms that had come upon the papacy, and he died with his name execrated in every country, and unregretted by a single human being. It might have been thought that whatever the northern races might feel, at least in the capital city of that papacy on behalf of which he had contended so strenuously, some reverence might have been felt for him. But it was not so. In a letter to the Duke of Norfolk 3 weeks after the Pope's death, a Roman Catholic correspondent, Gregory de Casale, writes thus: "The joy in Rome was great. The most bitter hatred was felt for the dead Pope by every human being, a hatred which, unappeased even by his death, showed itself by repeated nightly attacks upon his tomb. Once it was absolutely destroyed, and the corpse was found transfixed with a sword. And had it not been for respect to the Cardinal de Medici, Ippolito, the body would have been dragged through the city by a hook. At length an armed guard had to be set over the tomb, since it was every night broken and defiled with all sorts of filth." Thus ended Clement VII. By setting before himself ignoble aims, and pursuing them with complete unscrupulousness, he did the greatest harm to his own family, to Florence, to Italy, and to the papacy. He died leaving half Europe fallen away from the papacy, Rome a ruined city, the the name of his family hated where once it had been honored, and Italy, from Milan to Naples, a field of slaughter bathed in blood and tears. At first sight, Clement VII's pontificate is an enigma. He, one of the cleverest members of an exceptionally able family, who had been the guiding genius of the papacy throughout Leo X's much praised reign, seems in his own pontificate to be perpetually engaged in the most unsuccessful schemes, and involved in the most grievous troubles, indignities, and losses, all without any apparent necessity, and with a result which has caused his pontificate to be considered the most disastrous on record. The key, however, to this enigma, and the clue to the whole history of these 11 eventful years, is to be found in the reports of the Venetian ambassador at Rome, Antonio Suriano. The latter, immediately after Clement's death, set himself to show to his own government that one single underlying motive was the cause of all Clement's actions, and the key to his otherwise inexplicable conduct, and that this all-dominating motive was the endeavor to avoid the assembly of a general council. Suriano writes 2 long reports to his government to prove this point, and draws out in detail the many things which Clement was willing to endure for the sake of this one object, while he states that Clement's dread of a general council amounted to nothing short of abject terror. In his first report, Suriano points out at great length the many occasions on which this exaggerated terror had impelled Clement to the most strange course of conduct, stating that this overwhelming dread of the General Council, and this alone, induced the Pope to smother his resentment against the Emperor for the many mortifications received from him, and specially for the never to be forgotten outrage of the sack of Rome. All was, if not forgiven, endured in silence, so long as there was any hope that by keeping Charles in good humor the council might be staved off. And it was only when the Emperor definitively insisted on its assembly that Clement began again to lean towards Francis, in the hope that the latter would impede it. Suriano states that Clement would not even suffer the word to be mentioned in his presence, and gives in detail the many cogent reasons he had for dreading it. In his second report, the Venetian ambassador gives a masterly sketch of Clement's whole policy, and again points out that through all his manifold schemes there had been this one motive only. For this, says Suriano, took place the conference with the Emperor at Bologna, and the league between His Holiness, His Majesty the Emperor, and your Serene Highnesses. For this the cruel and shameful siege and conquest of Florence. For this the marriage between the Emperor's daughter, Margaret, and the infamous Alessandro. For this again the marriage between the Duchessina and the son of the King of France. Again, for the same reason, when the arrest in Hungary of the Cardinal Ippolito de Medici occasioned the Pope, on account of the indignity, such poignant grief that he wept over it, yet was it all passed over unnoticed. Nor could any circumstance avail to arouse Clement or cause him to quarrel with the Emperor, since His Holiness considered that the friendship of the Emperor secured him from the council so much dreaded by him. For this same cause, pursues the ambassador, although His Holiness had but little love for the Emperor, who ruled him and led him whithersoever he would, yet he was obliged against his will, by necessity, to consent to whatever the Emperor chose, without manifesting any resistance, and all this from fear of the council. Therefore, considering this his painful position, and the slavery, as it may be called, in which the Emperor held him, and still more the danger of the council, he began to show himself more accessible to the most Christian king, Francis I, and hence the marriage of the Duchessina was planned. His Holiness's idea was that by this alliance of his niece with the son of the King of France he should lay the foundation of 2 pillars of support for his family and his own affairs, especially in the so much dreaded matter of the council, in the hope that by these means some settlement of the religious questions might be attained, and at least the dreaded council be avoided. And Soriano sums up by saying, "Your lordships then may be assured that Clement used all possible means to avoid a council, and the fear of it tormented the mind of his Holiness to such a degree that by reason of it he even lost the friendship of the Emperor and of others, and finally his own life." To which may be added the break with England, for Clement would never have allowed the breach with Henry to occur had it not been for the threat of the assembly of a General Council, which Charles V intimated to him in the plainest terms should be the result of his agreeing to the divorce of his aunt. But there is something deeper to be seen here, though strangely enough it has passed without notice. If we look back through the long roll of the centuries, we shall see that all this means, in one word, retribution. And so we see Canossa at last avenged, and after 4 centuries and a half, instead of the scene enacted there, which burnt itself into the memory of Europe, we see the roles reversed, and behold a successor of the Emperor Henry IV making a successor of Pope Gregory VII his abject slave, who trembled before him, and placed the papal authority at his entire disposal, to be used only in accordance with his behests.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.